Welcome, everyone, to tonight's Association of Priests Speaker Series. Your sponsor here is the Association of Pittsburgh Priests, and our topic is risking prophecy in a time of bitter polarization. I can't think what would be more timely. Our speaker this evening is Father Ron Rolheiser, OMI, who is President Emeritus and a professor of spirituality of the Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio, Texas.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Maureen, for that very over-generous introduction. But thank you. Um, since the topic is heavy, I want to begin with just a couple of lighter stories. And we have a program here on aging, so I'm going to tell these are two stories, jokes about aging. In fact, you can decide whether the first one's a joke or not. But they tell the story of there are four elderly men, and they're in the retirement home, and they're lamenting about their declining health. The first man said, it's terrible. I can't see anymore. He said, I can't recognize a face 6 feet across the table. The second man said, I can see, but I can't hear. He said, I have hearing aids the size of a golf ball to hear anything. And the third man said, I have osteoporosis, and I'm just ossified. I can't turn a fraction to the right or to the left. The fourth man said, but thank God we can all still drive. Okay, so you can decide whether that's a joke or not a joke. Okay. Anyway, thank God we can all still drive. The second story told of a grandfather, and he was lamenting to his grandkids how life had just passed him by. He said, today everybody has a phone in their hand all the time and need an app to flush the toilet. You have to get an app or something. And he said, money means nothing. He said, but when I was a kid, I could go into the corner store with $1, and I would come out of the store with a candy bar, a Coca-Cola, a pack of gum, and a bag of chips. He said, you can't do that anymore today. He said, they have cameras everywhere. Okay. Our topic. I'm going to split the screen, and we're going to look at risking prophecy in a time of bitter polarization. Okay. I want to begin with a quote from Thomas Merton. He says, do not depend upon the results of your work. You may have to face the fact that your work may seem worthless and achieve no result at all, if not perhaps results opposite to what you expect. As you get used to this idea, you will start more and more to concentrate not on results, but on the value, the righteousness, and the truth of the work itself. You will gradually struggle less and less for an idea and more for specific people. In the end, it is the reality of personal relationship that saves everything. So I want to begin with a story. We're living in a very bitter time, very polarized time. It's painful to watch the news at night, as you know, and so on. And as Christians, we're called to be prophetic, but how? How do you do this? What's productive, what's counterproductive, and so on. So I want to begin with a story. It's actually my 10th point, but I'm going to use it at the beginning, because Merton says a lot about personal relationship. It's a story I heard from Mary Jo Leddy. I don't know if Canadians would know who she is. Mary Jo Leddy is a marvelous woman in Toronto who started Romero House. And she runs a house in Toronto for refugees and has been doing this for more than 30 years. And she tells this story. She said when the Romero House, they were given a very, very big house in a very affluent area of Toronto. And she started bringing refugees there. She said, but because it was in this very affluent area, the neighbors were berserk. They just said, this is horrible. You're bringing all these people from all these terrible countries. They're going to steal and they're going to rape our kids. And they're going to be this and that's it. So then we had this intense opposition. And she said, it took 10 years. So it took us 10 years and we wore down all the opposition to the very last bit. She said, you know how? Said we did it by being good neighbors. We were good neighbors. And she tells this particularly poignant story. Said the last holdout was a man, an older man, single, living by himself, was very negative towards their community. She said, and one day there was a big snowstorm, and a young African girl from Tanzania, 14 years old, without being asked, she went out and began to shovel off his sidewalk. And this man came out and was very irate. He says to this young girl, why are you doing this? Did you think I want to pay you? She said, I'm not going to pay you. She said, no, you don't have to pay me. He said, why are you doing this? And she said, because you're old. That's a good reason. Okay. He stomped back in the house. He came out 10 minutes later and he says, so who are you? Where are you from? And she told him a story. He said, why did you come here? He befriended that girl, and then he befriended the community. You know, that was prophetic. You know, that you're going to see that the greatest prophecy of all is hospitality, is reaching across this. I'm doing this for you because you're old and I'm young. Okay. I want to, what I call, give some commandments for the long haul about what is a prophet. And then hopefully we did the question period and stuff. We can talk about how we might do this today in a time of polarization. But these are some very important rules and not always followed on either side of the prophetic scale. You know, the first one is this: a prophet makes a vow of love, not of alienation. That's an important statement. As a prophet, you make a vow of love and not of alienation. So I'll give you an example, and I apologize because I want to use a colorful word here, but the word makes the thing, you know. I was once at a clergy conference, and then invited priests to go up and say, well, what's the gift you think you bring to the community? And one of the priests, who was out of ministry because he was a troublemaker and so on, he stood up and he said, my gift, he said, I'm a prophet. He said, I'm a shit disturber. Well, he was the latter, but he wasn't the former. So any prophet who defines himself or herself, I'm in your face, that's not prophecy. That's alienation. To make a vow of prophecy, you know, that so that we're not operating out of egotism, but we got to be operating out of hope. So, you know, as a prophet, you risk misunderstanding, but you never seek it. The difference, a risk misunderstanding, but never seek understanding. You're trying to love people, not to be in their face. Now, you may be in their face eventually, but that's not the vow we make. So a prophet is single-minded, can be understood, but he's always mellow of heart. Daniel Berrigan says, a prophet, how to love one's enemy even while standing in opposition to him. Okay. Or what is resistance? When is resistance the mature response to systems and powers that claim our lives? And when does it become a petulant form of egotism? Okay. Secondly, a prophet is grounded in a reality beyond this world. I want to give you just, I keep my eye on the clock here. The Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke is interesting in many ways. It's preeminently the Gospel of prayer. In the Gospel of Luke, they show Jesus praying more than all the other Gospels put together, but also the disciples are intrigued with Jesus' prayer. It's the only Gospel where they ask Jesus to teach them the Our Father. The other Gospels, Jesus gives the lesson. In Luke's Gospel, the disciples say, teach us how to pray. We want to know how to pray. Because they'd sensed something. They sensed that Jesus drew something from his prayer. That, you know, they were impressed with Jesus, not just because he was a miracle worker, but that somehow he had a power that they didn't have, precisely to love your enemy, to be calm and so on. And they knew he was drawing it from elsewhere. They knew he was drawing it from prayer. And so they said, teach us that. So that's the second thing. And I'll draw that out a little bit with the next point, that as a prophet, we need to be grounded in a reality from above, not anything else. Okay. Now, third one, a prophet draws his or her cause from Jesus and not from ideology. Again, I want to illustrate that with a story. Some years ago, I was listening to the radio here, and they were interviewing a woman from San Francisco. And she's an Episcopalian minister, priest, okay? but she's also done a lot of um, national work on ecology. So her passion is saving the planet and so on. And she does a lot of national work. Um, and so she's being interviewed here in Texas. Okay. And at one point, the interviewer said to her this. He said, you come from San Francisco, very liberal city. He said, now how does your gig go over here, your liberal gig, he said, ecology? How does it go over in Arkansas and in West Texas and in Alabama and those places? She gave a very good answer. She says, she says, traveling around, she says, sincere people hear the gospel. She said, I've had to learn this. When I come out of the gospel, people can hear me. If I come out of ideology, they turn me off like a water tap. And that's a very interesting distinction. When I come out of the gospel, she said, people can't turn the gospel off. They can turn the ideology off, So as an example, what's an ideology? Well, there's a difference between Jesus and Greenpeace. Now, don't get me wrong. Greenpeace does some wonderful things. It's an ideology. Or for instance, feminism. Feminism does some very, very important things, but it's an ideology. So if we speak out of an ideology, people can say, well, that's woke, or that's this, or that's whatever, we have to make those same truths, because they're truths, we have to bring them out through the Gospels, through Jesus, that's an interesting thing here. Let me make a comment. Like political correctness. Political correctness has hurt a lot of good causes. And the sad part is much of political correctness is correct. But people will turn off something that's the truth because it's politically correct. I want to tell a great story. And it's a Saskatchewan story too, When I was there provincial, I was living in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and I was on the priest's council for those 6 years. And we had a wonderful bishop, second generation Irish, conservative, but a very fine bishop. And one time he comes to the priest's council and he says this. He says, look, he said, we are not paying women in the diocese fair wages, and we need to. He said, now I want you to find a way by next month when we meet how we're going to do this. So a month later we met and the priest said, we can't do that. We simply don't have the money. We can't do it. He said, well, by next month, I want you to have a plan to do it because we're going to do it. So the third month, the priest said, we have no plan because it can't be done. He said, I've made very few executive decisions without consultation, but I make one now. We're going to do it. And I'm commanding it from the top down. And one of his priest friends, probably his closest friend, the priest friend, he said to him, called him by his first name. He said, Jim, you're just doing that because it's politically correct. You're working the chancery, you have all these women on your case. You're doing it because it's politically correct. And he said, no, we're doing it because it is correct. It's politically correct, but it can also be correct. See, this is a great issue we're struggling with right now. How we get truths across, that they come across, like this woman said, they're coming from Jesus. Like, for instance, the refugee thing, it's so clear. It's on every, and immigrant, it's on every line of scripture, this isn't the woke agenda, or it's not the agenda of whoever. It's gospel, but we have to somehow get it across as gospel. That's a huge struggle. Okay. And then we commit to nonviolence. If you ever get a chance to watch this movie, if you haven't, find it and stream it, called Of Gods and Men. And it's a true story of these 9 Trappist monks who were martyred in Algeria in 1996. And Christian Descharges, who was their abbot, who was also martyred, but his diaries, which are presented there, and their response to violence was to become nonviolent. He said, we need to, in the face of all guns, we need to disarm. When Al Qaeda came to him the first time and they threatened them and to kidnap them, he said, now we really need to disarm. We need to rely on nothing but God's power. I'm going to give you a little Greek lesson here. In Scripture, okay, there's different words for power. That in fact, we get some English words like the word energy is a Greek word, energy, that's a power, or dynamite, dynamis is power. But when they say Jesus speaks with great power, it's interesting. They said the others speak with power. They don't speak with power. He speaks with great power. They said because he speaks with exousia. We have no word like that in English. We have a concept. Exousia is the ultimate power that comes from powerlessness. This is an image. If you put a football player and a rock star and a baby in a room, who has the most power? Ultimately, the baby. See that our power is not the power of firepower, of athletes' power, of some kind of dynamic power. Our power is the power of powerlessness of the baby. Notice for centuries they wanted a superstar to be born, and the Messiah they got was a baby in the straw. See, so in our prophecy always has to come out of this powerlessness. Everybody's trying to overpower us, politically, economically, whatever. Our power is the power of exousia, the helpless child. Okay. Then the prophet articulates God's voice for the poor on the earth. In one of the Gospels, Jesus' opening statement is this. He says, I have come to bring good news to the poor. I have come to bring good news to the poor. Now, what that means is that any preaching we do, any teaching we do, any action we do, which isn't good news for the poor, is not the gospel of Jesus. That's Scripture. A prophet, everything we do, we have to articulate somehow our voices for the poor. And any prophet who's not speaking for the poor is not a prophet of Jesus. Now, who are the poor? So, well, is it the economically poor? Is it the, Well, Scripture defines the poor. Scripture has a category in Old Testament, New Testament. They call them the poor are widows, orphans, and strangers with quotation marks around. Those were the three most vulnerable groups in their society at the time. Who are the most vulnerable groups in our society today? We have to speak for. Who are the widows? Who are the orphans? The strangers we already know. Those are the people on our borders. Those are refugees and so on, or people of other races and so on. Who are the three most vulnerable groups? Or Gustavo Gutierrez, the great liberation theologian, he says, he said that the poor are the excluded one. When Caiaphas says about Jesus, it's better one man should die for the people. Who are we saying this about? Is it the unborn? Is it the strangers? Is it whatever? Who is expendable? And Gustavo himself says, the poor are those people who don't have a right to have rights. Okay. So a prophet articulates God's voice for the poor. Then a prophet doesn't foretell the future, but properly aims the present in function of the future. A prophet reads where the finger of God is within everyday life, in function of naming our fidelity or our infidelity to God, in function of pointing to our future in terms of God's plan for us. A couple of quotes I find meaningful. Richard Rohr, who many of you know, Rohr says, not everything can be fixed or cured, but it should be named properly. Prophets don't predict the future. They name the present properly, which means how is God seeing how we're living right now? Okay. Or James Hillman, the great agnostic from our culture. James Hillman was an agnostic philosopher out of St. Louis who died a few years ago, who wrote, to my mind, the deepest literature we have on soul that's been written in philosophical and psychological in our time, comes from an agnostic. He said, a symptom suffers most when it doesn't know where it belongs. I like that. Imagine you have some nagging thing and then you think it might be cancer, it might be this, and you see your doctor and the doctor says it's arthritis. It's not pleasant. You know what it is. See, a prophet names the symptom. Okay. John at the cross, speaking in a different vocabulary. He says, the language of God is the experience that God writes into our lives. Jesus said, read the signs of the times, or become a meteorologist of the spirit. Where is God? How is God? And where is God speaking in our time? What's God saying? So, for instance, when you look at what's happening today in the American political scene, what's happening in Gaza, what's happening with the starving people on the Gaza Strip, but even worse in other parts of the world. What's God saying? Where's the finger of God? What does it mean for us? Okay. Then a prophet speaks out of a horizon of hope. I want to do a major little section on this, an horizon of hope. I don't think we often understand what hope is. And hope, as I say, as distinct from wishful thinking and distinct from optimism. If you say, I hope I could win a lottery, you can't say that. You can wish to win a lottery, but the wish isn't based on anything. Or also a natural optimism. Someone says, I'm a hopeful person. I always see the bright side of things. No, you can be a pessimist and have hope. You can be a high optimist and have no hope. I want to illustrate that with a series of stories. The first man you see there, he's the bishop, I think, in Three Rivers, Ontario, Pierre Olivier Tremblay, good Canadian oblate. But he spoke in our school some years ago when he was still a very young man. And he gave an interesting talk. At that time, he said, I am chaplain at the University of Laval in Quebec City. He said, and I'm working with young people. He said, I'm working with 18 to 22 or 23-year-old kids. And he said, at that age, they're just full of life. They're just full of life. They're full of energy. They have all this excess energy in life. He said, but almost none of them have any hope. It's interesting. They're full of life, they're full of energy, but almost none of them have any hope. He said, why? He said, because they don't have a meta-narrative. He said, the only narrative they have is their own story. And when their own story goes well, they're up. Then they break up with a boyfriend or girlfriend, and they're suicidal, and this happens, and so on. He said, they don't have a meta-narrative. They don't have a big story with it to understand their own life. And says, that's why they don't have any hope, okay? Because your own story doesn't give you that. What is a meta-narrative? My favorite philosopher in the last some centuries is the French philosopher Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was also one of the great scientists of the last century. And he was a mystic who had, to my mind, still of all the people and theologians in the last 50 or 70 years, the best narrative where we're going. He was a scientist, so he started with the Big Bang Theory. And then he took scripture and he laid them together, and he just showed how the mystery of Christ and Christianity is all working through evolution, through what's happening today, and how it's all going to culminate the way we read in Ephesians 5, with it coming together in one kingdom in Christ. So he gave this talk one day. He's a scientist. And one of his scientific colleagues said, well, that's a nice optimistic little schema. Said, suppose we blow up the world with an atomic bomb, then what happens to this? Teilhard smiled and said, if we blow up the world with an atomic bomb, he said, that'll be a 2 million year setback. He said, it'll be a 2 million year setback. He said, what I say is going to happen, he said, not because I wish it. He said, I believe it because God promised it, and in the resurrection of Jesus, God shows that God delivers on the promise. If you want the root for hope and for Christianity, it's in that statement. The promise of God and then the resurrection of Jesus, which means we can kill it. We can blow up the world. We can kill ourselves. It doesn't matter. We're going to rise, That's why St. Paul says, if there's no resurrection, Christians are the most deluded of all people. If there's a resurrection, it all makes sense. See, that's the meta-narrative. God promised, do it. It's going to have a happy ending. The ending of your story is written and it's happy. Okay. You just have to trust it, and it doesn't depend on you. It doesn't depend on the world situation. That's the deeper thing. A couple of little quick stories, Bishop Tutu, as you see there, with apartheid in Africa. And they used to try to intimidate him. So they said he'd be preaching in a church in Cape Town. And He'd begin his homily, and the soldiers would walk down both sides of the aisle with machine guns, trying to intimidate him. He'd smile at them and he'd say, well, I'm glad you came to church. I suspect your mothers are happy that you finally came to church. He said, but I'm glad you came to join the winning side. He said, we have already won. He wasn't talking about apartheid. He was talking about the big picture. When Jesus rose from the grave, we've already won. Hans Urs von Balthasar, the famous theologian, said, he says, you can imagine life as like a 5-act play. And, you're in act 3 and things are going really badly, but the ending of the story. In the end, you're going to live happily ever after. The ending of our story is already written. And it's the great woman mystic, Julian of Norwich, said centuries ago, she says, in the end, all will be well, and all will be well, and every manner of being will be well. That's the big narrative. To which Oscar Wilde added, he said, and if it isn't well, then it's still not the end. None of you have woke up dead yet, and you never will. Okay, see, but that's what Trombley calls the meta-narrative. He said, you can be full of life and energy and so on. You don't have any hope. You can be pessimistic. Teilhard was a bit of a pessimist in this world, but great hope. He said, it's going to happen. Not because I hope it or wish it. God promised it. Okay. Hope is based on God's promise and God's power as revealed in the resurrection of Jesus. Okay. Then, a prophet's heart and cause are never a ghetto. I love this expression from Nikos Kazantzakis, the great Greek writer. He says, the bosom of God is not a ghetto, but the heart of man often is. God, when Jesus says, in my Father's house, there are many rooms. Part of our prophecy is always to make that. The Father's house is wide. There are many rooms, and false prophecy will invariably make God our own tribal deity. And today we're seeing that all over. We're seeing that all over, I don't want to pick on any political group, but, where other people's lives are not as important as their own, or, make America great again. Well, you can do that politically. You can't do it in God's eyes. You can't put a divine cloak around that, God is, everybody is equal, all lives have the same importance, and we're so invariably trying to, with forms of nationalism. I don't want to tick just on Americans. That's all over. Nationalism, it doesn't mean you can't love your own, but you can never make God's heart a ghetto. Okay. Then a prophet doesn't just write or speak, a prophet acts, and acts with courage, even at the cost of death. A prophet is a magus. Now, if you ever studied the archetypes, a magus, or if you're a woman, that's Sophia. Magus is a wisdom figure. Okay. That's somebody who, they distill wisdom. You teach, Sophia. But one of the issues, and I am one of those figures, is that when you become a magus or a Sophia, oftentimes you can write about it, you can speak about it, but we're not the ones out of the picket line. We're not at the ones, that like Dorothy Day, Daniel Berrigan, these people, they were out on the picket lines. Remember one of my profs once was teaching this, and he says, the danger, we're all professors and so on. He said, we all have the right causes, but we never act. He said, when the last tree in America has been cut down, he said, academics don't have written a whole lot of studies about why it shouldn't be done. See, we know how to speak, write and speak. Oftentimes, we struggle to engage. That's where we can learn from people like Dorothy Day, from the Berrigans, and so on. So a prophet has enough altruistic love, hope, and courage to not count the cost of prophecy. And you never seek martyrdom, but you accept it if it comes. And then number 10, I've told you that. The ultimate hospitality is prophecy, the Mary Jo Liddy story. The young girl shoveled the man's walk, and because of that, he he heard her story and he opened up. And then he heard other people's stories and so on. And then finally, you know what? Moses came down with 10 commandments, and here I'm handing you 11. So you got one extra one. And that is, a prophet can discern at which times to park the placard and bring out the basin and towel. I was lucky enough in my academic training to twice have Raymond Brown, the great scripture scholar, as a professor. And Brown wasn't just a great scripture scholar, he was a wonderful priest and a very profound human being and a prophetic man. And he said, sometimes he said, life causes, you need to be causey. There's times you need to be out there with a placard. You need to be out with, protesting something, He said, but you also have to know when it's time to put away the placard and bring out the basin and the towel. What does he mean by that? The basin and the towel. Okay. I want to take a little time. We just have about 5 minutes left here to look at that text in John's gospel. Jesus washing the feet. Okay. It's interesting. We have 4 gospels. And in the other 3 gospels, the Last Supper scene is one paragraph. At the Last Supper, Jesus took bread, took wine, said, my body is my blood, do it in memory of me. In John's gospel, the Last Supper scene is over half of the whole gospel. Jesus is giving a long talk, and no bread and wine appear. It's interesting. In John's gospel, the Last Supper, Jesus never brings out bread and wine. He brings out a basin and a towel, where the others bring out bread and wine. That's a powerful text. Let me just give you the text as it's written, and then we'll parse it. So John, the writer of John, says, at the supper, the Last Supper, Jesus, knowing that he had come from God and knowing that he was going back to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and began to wash the disciples' feet against their protests. After he had washed their feet, he put on his outer robe again, interesting symbol, and then he said, I want you to do this, as I've taught you, wash each other's feet. What is the meaning of that symbol? What does it mean? Well, like most things in Scripture, it has levels of meaning. It has levels of meaning. So that, and we get the first level, and it's an important level. So we say that is servant leadership. Servant leadership. The master washes the disciples' feet. The master stoops down to wash the servant. Okay. And that's part of it. That's an important part of it. It's not the whole of it, and it's an important part of it. Remember, one of my favorite religious poets is John Shea, the Chicago John Shea, and he wrote a poem on this, and he said, at the Last Supper, Jesus got up from the table. He said he took the mantle of privilege, he turned it upside down and turned it into the apron of service. It's a beautiful line. Turn the mantle of privilege upside down into the apron of service. Okay. That's the first thing. But there's something deeper. He's showing us an act of humility, but there are different kinds of humility. And some humility feels clean, and some humility doesn't feel clean at all. So I'll give you an example. Imagine it's Christmas Day, and before you eat your Christmas dinner, you go downtown and you work in a soup kitchen and help feed homeless people for some hours. That's a wonderful act. That's servant leadership, okay? But you know something? You'll feel good. You'll feel good you've done this. There'll be no awkwardness. But imagine there are forms of humility that don't feel good. They feel very, very awkward. So let me give you an example, and I'm risking this example. If I say to you and talk about prophecy, say, what is the single biggest moral divisive issue in our culture today? And it's easy. It's abortion. We are divided on abortion. Good people from good people, sincere people from sincere people. Okay, it divides people. It divides courts. It decides elections, and so on. You know what John would do? Incidentally, if John wrote this gospel, he'd been a very old man. This was written in the mid-90s. He'd have been 90 years old. You know what he'd do? He said, you know what? How would we do with abortion? Let's not argue it anymore. Let's not bring out placards. Let's bring out a basement towel. And then we're going to make, pro-life wash the feet of pro-choice. Then we'll get some pro-choice women wash the feet of pro-life women. And then we'll get Donald Trump to wash Nancy Pelosi's feet. And we'll get Nancy Pelosi to wash Donald Trump's feet. And we'll get some Democrats to wash Republican feet, and Republicans to wash Democrats' feet. And we'll get some Christians to wash some Muslim feet. And then maybe we'll understand what communion is. See, that's a different kind of reaching across. That's a different kind of humility, It's interesting, as a priest, because as Roman Catholics, on Holy Thursday, when we celebrate the Eucharist, the institution, we don't read the institution account of the gospel. We read the basement towel. And then we always have to do this gesture of washing feet. And you know something, I'll confess, I've always found that awkward and something I didn't like doing, because you're not comfortable and the people getting their feet washed are not comfortable. It's awkward. It's awkward until you realize the whole thing, it's meant to be awkward. That is the whole purpose of the exercise. It was awkward at the Last Supper. It's awkward. You're reaching across, pro-life watching, pro-choice. It's awkward. But it stretches you, see, and Jesus said, that is prophecy. That is prophecy. Can we reach across and wash each other's feet? It's interesting. One last thing, and then I'll stop here. The little thing about taking off the outer robe, they said, knowing he had come from God, he was going back to God. He got up from the table and took off his outer robe, and then he washed the feet. Then he put it back on. What's the outer robe? That's more than a piece of cloth. That's the normal things we wear. For instance, what's my outer robe? I'm male. I'm a Canadian. I'm a Roman Catholic. I'm pro-life. I'm this. I'm that. I'm all these things. I'm a Catholic priest. I'm a missionary. Okay, that's my outer robe. That's important. And when I wear that, there's certain people's feet I'm not going to wash. But if I take it off, then I'm like Jesus said, your own identity. I've come from God. I'm going back to God. And then all things are possible. Underneath all the outer robes you're wearing, your deep identity, you have come from God and you're going back to God. And therefore, all things are possible for you. But notice he put it back on again. Normally, we need those outer robes. There's selective times when we need to take it off. Incidentally, as a last piece, if you understand Pope Francis, and part of the essence of his papacy that he's trying to get this thing across, where you have an outer robe and you can take that off. So for instance, when Pope Francis says, they ask him, can a priest marry gay people? He says, no, but yes. Can't do it in church, but you can still do it. You've got to take off the outer robe. So many things. Can you give the last rites to somebody who's doing assisted suicide? No. And yet you have to, and so on. See, that there's a lot to this washing of the feet text. And Raymond Brown said, we have to know exactly when we have to park the placard where you say it's enough protesting for abortion or for refugees or whatever, against abortion or, refuge, and when you have to bring out a basement towel, take off the outer robe and reach across to the other side. Okay. That, Gretchen, is my spiel. Yeah, I see it there. So let me just read it. It said, you skipped Hans Urs von Balthasar. Do you think the patron principle and the Marian principle combined with the administrative way may mean management and not ministry for women in the church? Can the church apply the gospel to itself, perhaps in terms of the actual ordination of women? Phyllis, I agree with you. Basically, I have to be careful what I get in trouble for saying here and so on. But I think that, well, let me put it more widely. I think one of the places where we need to be prophetic today, all over, is for women. We are far, far from equality of women in society and in the churches, and so that we need to push this. Maybe, Phyllis, I'll just answer with a story. I was once watching an interview with Morris West, the great Australian novelist, and someone said to him, he said, "Do you believe women could be priests?" And Morris West said, "Do I believe it?" He said, "All the most powerful priests in my life have been women." He said, beginning with my mother, who taught me the faith. He said, with my wife, who's my confessor, with all the many women who have called me to the table, have formed community. So see, these are the Christ as high priest, or Christ as priest, is teacher, community builder, and sacraments, and women have been doing them, are still doing them. The church needs to continue to look at this, and yeah, it's and I think, well, one has to be careful today inside the church, speaking prophetically, but I agree with you.
Thank you. We have a question from Jeff asking if we have placards for protesting and wash basins for washing, how do both parties or both sides agree that it's time for one or the other?
Good question, Jack. It's they're not going to agree. It's it's up to us. It's up to you as an individual to say, it's time for me to do that. You can't do it for somebody else. You can't. I mean, if somebody agrees and so on, but you have to come to that point where you say, I need to do that, whatever the cost, and I need to do it carefully, so that I'm not that's still a vow of love and not of alienation, but I need to find ways of reaching across. But it won't be done so much across the negotiating table, it's going to be done more in your private conscience, where you say, I need to do this, and maybe with a series of friends where you pray together, and say, like, we need to do this. That's still more powerful still, and so on. But you won't necessarily find somebody on the other side who's going to reciprocate, or maybe you can, like, people are trying to set this up, but, so that they're trying to set up forums and stuff where we can get together and agree to disagree and to love each other across those differences. That's prophetic. But sometimes you just have to do it, whether it's reciprocated or not reciprocated.
Bernie asks, what is the church's stance on DEI?
What is the church? Well, again, make a distinction. The church doesn't take a stance on a political bill or something, but the church takes a stance on truth. Okay, and if you look at the New Testament, you look at Jesus. Jesus calls for the radical equality of everybody, in the exclusion of nobody, and so on. And so, how you want to interpret that politically? Does that mean the university can take somebody over somebody else or whatever? Those are political decisions. The moral issue is clear. The moral issue is everybody is the same. Everybody should have equal opportunity. And also, part of that is that this may be where it gets more dicey, that historical inequality has to be redressed. Like, if you do a wrong, you don't just say moving forward. like give you an example. And they say in confession, if you steal from somebody, the confessor is supposed to say, you got to return this. You got to return some property and so on. You can't just say, well, I stole $1 million and now I'm confession and I'm clear. He said, no, you have to someone give it back. So, as Christians, we are called upon to redress historical wrongs, to do with slavery, to do with the indigenous peoples and so on, to do with people we haven't treated fairly, and will that shake out socially, politically into DEI in some forms? Maybe it does. I mean, those are things that can be argued. The principles can't be argued. If you look at the history of the United States, or you look at the history of Canada, we both have some original sins. Jim Wallace wrote about the United States. He said, the United States, the original sin was slavery, and we're still dealing with it. Mary Jo Letty wrote a fine book, said, in Canada, the original sin was how we dealt with the indigenous people. And we weren't fair, and it's still there today, and we can't just say, well, to them, get over it. So, that was a long time ago. No, there has to be certain kind of redress. There has to be certain turning back to that and so on. And will that mean, institutional decisions to do with diversity and so on? Maybe DEI, but as our prophet, we have to always push the principles: equality, everybody's equal, and also historical unfairness has to be redressed. You can't just say, well, that was a long time ago, it has nothing to do with me. Yes, it has to do with, because we're reaping the benefits of that and so on. Very simply, I'm a Canadian, I can say this. So we took a country away from the natives, and we say, like, you should get over it. We don't owe you anything. Well, other than the country, we owe you nothing. So it's too simple to say, well, let's just start from scratch and there's no DEI. No, there's radical inequality in our countries. There has been radical inequality, and there's been radical unfairness. Nobody can say like slavery wasn't unfair, or the way we took the land from the indigenous people was fair. Nobody can say that. You can't say that with a straight face. And so we'd like to believe that this can just go away. It's not going to go away. Wound doesn't go away till it's dealt with.
Thank you. We have a question from, it looks like from one of your brother pastors or priests. In these divisive times, what advice do you have for pastors preaching to assemblies divided between red and blue? We don't want to drive people away, but we also want to be credible in terms of speaking to the gospel.
That is the $1 million question. Okay, and I sympathize. How do you preach? I know I teach at a theology school where it's easier, but I have good friends among the pastors here and so on. Some of them, it is really a struggle. So they're when you're looking at a congregation, half are one way and half are the other way, and there's all this bitter polarization. How do you do that? I'll say, how do you preach? I'll say, you preach carefully. No, but the trouble is, you can't just preach carefully. I want to quote Jim Wallace. Jim Wallace says, the gospel is political. Okay, so it can't be political. No, it's gospel. The gospel is political, but it can't be partisan. There's the difference. Issues are political, and so you address them as political issues, but not necessarily as partisan issues. So we'll take an example. For instance, the issue of immigrants and refugees. That is clearly gospel. And at a certain time we can not talk about it. But how you talk about it to say, well, it's a Democrat Republican issue. No, it's a moral issue. It's a Christian issue. And And I've had conversations with our own Archbishop, who is a wonderful man, about how do you do that? How do you just challenge with the gospel in a way that isn't partisan? Um, and and maybe it's going to come out partly as partisan, but it has to be done. But then, as a Roman Catholic priest, you have a great, great weapon that, and that is you have the Eucharist to follow. I'll tell you a story which I found very powerful. We have a lot of evangelicals in our school right now here. And so a couple of years ago for the Vance lecture, we brought in a man called David Gushee. And Gushee's a major evangelical teacher and preacher in the United States, very bright man. But during the question period, someone said to him, he said, why do our evangelical churches, we just keep dividing? You have a town of 5,000 people, and you have 3 evangelical churches. And Gushee said this, because we make preaching central, and we don't, as Roman Catholics do, make the Eucharist central. Then he said this, the Eucharist is the only thing that is nonpartisan. He said, all preaching, he said, no matter how carefully you do it, you're going to land a little bit one way or the other. He said, the Eucharist is the only thing that's nonpartisan. He said, you can be woke, you can be MAGA, you can go to the same Eucharist. Oftentimes you can't listen to the same homilist. These are the times, and it's difficult, and you have to. Let me give you one last image here. We have a saying among the oblates on some of these issues. We say you have to also weigh, is this cross worth dying on? So if I make a point here, is it going to be worth losing some parishioners or whatever, or do I back away here? These are difficult decisions to say, like, I'll make this point, but I'm going to lose parishioners. Is this worth it? Is this cross worth dying on? I think you get the image and so on. But I give you my sympathy. You have to try, but you're, as a priest, you're trying to keep these people in community, and how do you do this and at the same time be true to the gospel?
Thank you. We had a question about, isn't one way to wash the other's feet to pray for those whom we consider the enemy and to love them, so using no cynical language against them, etc., nonviolence and language and tone in reference to others? Asking for your thoughts about that.
Excellent point. Well, let me start here with Jesus. There's an incident in Scripture where the disciples come back, and Jesus comes back, and the disciples have been trying to cast out a demon, and they can't do it. And then Jesus casts out the demon, and they say, why couldn't we do it? And Jesus says, some demons are only cast out by prayer. There's certain demons, only prayer will cast them out. Now, the demon he was talking about was a demon that had rendered a person deaf and mute. Okay. I want to name the demon we're talking about. The demon of division, the demon of misunderstanding or lack of understanding. That's the demon that at a certain point can only be cast out by prayer. Now, I don't want to make this as a pious statement. So I'm going to give you an example. I'm a great fan of the Quakers and what they call a Quaker silence. The Quakers, today they have a wider liturgy. They even have Eucharist. But when the Quakers were first formed by George Fox, their liturgy, what we would call their liturgy, basic liturgy, was simply what they call a Quaker silence. They would meet in community, and they would sit in a circle, and they would sit in silence. But they would sit there communally, but the communal silence was intended to say, God, we are here, and we are helpless. We want you to come and give us something we can't give ourselves, which is community. We can't give ourselves community. There's always something in the way of community. You have to give us what we can't give ourselves. Well, I think today as Christians, whether you call it Quaker silence or as the French call it oraison or whatever, we need to do prayer where we just sit prophetically in silence as a group. That's very different than private, private meditation where you're trying to cultivate an intimacy with God. Here you're sitting with a group in liturgy saying, come and give us community. We can't form community in ourselves. I think we have to take our helplessness to God and have some form of Quaker silence or whatever we call it, you know. And I think the Eucharist, because it's a ritual, in some ways does that. You know, it is in some ways functions as a Quaker silence. You know, and I remember simply as a kid growing up in Saskatchewan, Cactus Lake, Gretchen, I'll throw that in. And we were a big family, and every night we'd say the family rosary. And we it would take about 15 minutes, and we knelt and lean on chairs and so on. But it was functioned like a Quaker silence. It would calm you right down, and all the little arguments you had and so on would disappear. you know, it gave us community. You know, so the rosary functions in that way. But today we may never forget the power of prayer, and then also never forget, as Chardin says, never forget hope. We've already won this.
Hmm. We had a great question about to better understand the role and life of the prophets following your 10 points of prophecy. Can you share the prophets of today?
Just give that to me again.
So, in the context of your 10 points of prophecy, and to help us better understand the role and the life of the prophets, who do you consider to be the prophets of today?
Okay, that's a good question, but I'm going to preface it by saying it's going to be very subjective. It's kind of like, who do I feel are mentored by prophets today? Okay. Well, there's people who have been prophetic models in my life, so I named like Dorothy Day, Daniel Berrigan, and Berrigan's worth reading. Like, when you you sometimes get the impression from his life that he was this renegade and so on, and he was in trouble. No, when you read him or you read about him and so on, he was a very, very careful prophet. For instance, one of our oblates, Larry Rosebow, who went to prison with the Berrigans, and Larry was later shot to death in Guatemala, But Larry told me, he said, whenever they would do an act with Daniel Berrigan, they would be before they did, they would spend the entire night in prayer. And the next morning they'd say mass as priests, and they'd put in their vestments, and they'd walk across. And Daniel would always say, if you can't do this without hating the people you're doing this, don't do it. Don't do it. You gotta love the people, and a lot of the principles I pulled out today are pulled from Daniel Berrigan. So Daniel Berrigan, and again, these are my heroes. Jim Wallace, who's an evangelical in Washington, D.C., wide ecumenical sympathies. Jim Wallace describes himself. He said, I'm an evangelical convert to Roman Catholic social doctrine married to an Episcopalian priest. Okay, so he's pretty wide. But Jim is kind of our modern Dorothy Day in terms of his writing. Gustavo Gutierrez, whom I had the good fortune to get to know on a personal level and so on, hand an honorary doctorate to. He was prophet. Again, these people, they stood out also by their mellowness and by their humanness and so on. And then that Trappist, Christian Descharges, who I talked about, you read their diaries. They were incredible people and so on. These are just people who have been models in my life, so there's others. And the Dorothy Stang, and some of these other women who died in Latin America. I know some evangelical young people who were martyred and so on for their stance and so on. Romero's a hero of mine and so on. These are, to me, and they were kind of, they say, like high level, the world. But a lot of people have just been whose names aren't known. Um, we have people in this city like Patty Radel and others who they feed the hungry, they take care of the poor, um, they stand up for what's right. Um, um, so that I know a lot of people whose names are not known, but I look at them and say, "Wow, they're living the gospel." That's what it means to be prophetic.
Thank you. And a follow on about prophets. A question was posed about whether you think that prophets speak more to communal salvation than personal salvation.
A good question, but a tricky one. I don't want to answer that because in some sense, we may not make that distinction. In some sense, yeah. If you're, what's good for one person, if it's right, is also good for the community. It's good for the community in the right sense. It's good for the one person. So that I would have to think this thing through a little bit. I'm coming off the top of my head here, um, um, but somehow it seems to me that it shouldn't be one or the other. They should never be in conflict. If it isn't good for the community, it's probably not going to be good for this one person, and vice versa. You know.
Understood. And coming back around to an earlier topic, might conversations be encouraged or sponsored between parishes? For example, parishes led by religious orders with diocesan parishes as a way toward decreasing division and increasing mutual understanding.
Yeah, it, absolutely. I mean, I don't have a lot to say because for sure, any kind of dialogue like that can be set up or any kind of forums are going to be helpful. One of the things I learned from Henry Nouwen, or at least he articulated it for me, was that compassion is collective. The more collect, communitarian is, the more powerful it is. That's also true for prophecy. A community, has more prophetic power than just one person. The same as a community has more and more compassion power than one person. There's a line I got from Edward Skillebeck, but the Oblates have stolen it now and we use it in our documents, but it's from Skillebeck. But Skillebeck used to say, what you dream alone remains a dream. What you dream with others can become a reality. That's a good line. What you dream alone remains a dream. What you dream with others can become a reality. See, alone, we're only the strength of our own charism, our own, together, we can save the world, if we get enough people together.
And what are your thoughts on how we can help heal the division within the church?
Well, those are all questions that 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 need their own forum. Heal
Mhm.
division within the church. Um, well, I'm going to give some, how do you say, short answers, but the substance. First of all, the Eucharist. We got to keep going to Eucharist. Uh, Ronald Knox, the great British theologian, once said, he says, as Christians, we've never really been faithful to Jesus. He said, we don't love our enemies. We don't turn the other cheek. He said, but we've been faithful in one great way. We've kept the Eucharist going. He said, that is our one great act of fidelity. He said, in the end, it's going to be enough. We got to keep coming together. We got to keep coming together in Eucharist, but we also have to keep coming together in charity and openness. Um, um, that um, but although there's so many kind of nuances has to be put on the second part, coming together in charity and openness, and I know people who where they are at and with their particular wounds, they can't come together right now because they're in what I call convalescence. It's not like they've moved away from ecclesial community. They're in convalescence from ecclesial community, and they got to be helped to recover, to come back to community, and so on. So that there's nuances that the Eucharist itself is not nuanced. Basically, that Jesus said, "Keep doing that till I come back." And if we keep doing it and keep getting together, we'll eventually come together as a community. Um, but um, but overcoming division in the church is a lot like trying to overcome division in society. It's um, we have just these deep ideological, theological divisions, and
There was a follow-on question posed whether the synodal process might be, or how might that be, a help in healing division in the church.
well, Francis introduced that, and his belief is that can help. like he's saying, like what can we do? He said, well, this is one thing we can do. Um, um, it's not a panacea, but we can get together and we can talk, and as long as we're doing this and getting more voices to the table, um, um, like we're moving ahead. You know, um, and so I support the synodal process completely, and it's the one thing we do have going right now. Um, and anything is something. I'm not sure that's a great aphorism, but it sounds good. Anything is something. Okay.
And speaking of Pope Francis, there's a question about your thoughts on him as a potential prophet of our time.
Yes. Prophet in different sense, like um, Francis, the prophets that I named, those were people who stood out outstandingly in terms of social justice. Like Romero, he gets shot for the poor. Um, Francis has been for the poor, but I want to give John Paul II credit too. John Paul II, in social justice, with a couple of exceptions, one of them being the stance on women and liberation theology, the other one. He wrote some fine encyclical on social justice and so on, and challenged in a way I'm not sure that his devotees always picked up on, and so on. But Francis has been, to me, his deep prophecy has been a different level, and that's his how we need to turn the church into a field hospital. That for me, it's a powerful prophetic image, an image of church that we're not this bastion of the carrying truths throughout centuries and so on. We're a barrel of truths. And no, we're meant to be field hospital. And there he's been very, very prophetic in terms of the inclusivity and who we reach out to and how we can reach out to everybody and so on. I'll just give you one example. He wrote not an encyclical, but a letter to priests back probably 2015 or 16 or something, which stunned me. Just I thought, I never heard a Pope say this. And he said, the priest said, look, he said, when you're in the confessional box, you are meant to be that person's way to reconciliation. He said, find a way. He said, and if you can't find a way, then stop hearing confessions. He said, you don't tell a sick person you're too sick to see the doctor. Isn't that an incredible line? He says, when you send somebody who says, I can't help you, it's like somebody going to a doctor and says, you're sick, I can't help you. That's why they're there. He said, if you can't find a way to compassion and forgiveness, he said, then don't hear confessions. See, he's been powerfully prophetic in that way, challenging, like, for me as a priest, you're a field hospital. You're not just a treasure chest of truths and so on. Those things are important. His prophecy is more the poor, reaching out, finding a way to get everybody to the table. That's Francis' powerful. Now, he's written the most. No pope has written anything further as far on the ecology, Laudato Si. So he has come out with some far-reaching social encyclicals, but I think his real prophecy has been to challenge us to be this compassionate church. That we're like Jesus. Everybody can come and eat at the table.
I we'll need to move on to the next section, but I want to share something from the chat that's not exactly a question, but the statement that Dei, as in DEI, but Dei is Latin for of God. And Barbara shares that she finds herself when the topic comes up of DEI saying a quick prayer, Mater Dei, intercede for us, intercede on behalf of this particular issue. And that, while not a question, I think is a pretty lovely takeaway for us. So I'd like to offer, Father Ron, if you could share a few closing remarks with us as we move toward the end of our fantastic session together.
Okay. Sometimes when they give 10 commandments, I put this one in, and one of them is that in times like this, where we're trying to be, prophetic and everything is heavy, that inside of that, to retain some lightness, to retain some banter, to retain some. Give me an example. When in Greeks, when the Greeks defined love, they say love has 6 components. They said love can mean infatuation, sexual attraction, it can mean obsession. They said it can mean friendship. It includes, care. It includes, altruism. It also should include what they call estimos, which is kind of banter and humor and stuff that brings some lightness to it. That for instance, I live in a religious community, and I've lived in a religious community for more than 50 years now. And you don't get a chance to pick who you live with. Okay, you're assigned people. Religious community, and many of you are nuns. Sometimes it works wonderfully, even though we're different, because there's a lot of banter, there's humor, there's teasing, there's wit, which can cover up the rough edges of difference. There's nothing more depressing. Give you an example. We used to have one priest, bless him, was a sincere man, but somebody would tell a joke at the table and he'd say, would you tell that in front of the Blessed Sacrament? Well, that takes the oxygen out of a room, kind of, okay, we'll eat the meal in silence and so on. As opposed to just some healthy give and take and so on. A couple of years ago in Commonweal, and I hope I pronounced her name right, I read this poem by a woman called Liz Probeba, and she had this marvelous poem. And at the end, she says, I think I'm a good person, she said, but I'm aging, she said. And she ended by said, and now she said, I'm an aging white woman with no banter in my life. I thought, what an incredible Senator Bassett said, what a great I need some banter. I'm not sure if people ever get the real zest of the wedding feast at Cana. When Mary comes up to, she says, they don't have any wine. Have you ever noticed, you ever thought that she didn't say they don't have any protein? She didn't come to just say, no, I've checked the fridge. There's no protein. There's just have Doritos and Coke. She said, they don't have any wine. They're at the center of life and it's flat. There's no banter. There's no wit. There's nothing. See, wine's an extra. Wine isn't the protein. So what we need to bring to our prophecy, we need to bring some wine. We need to bring some banter. We need to bring some, that not everything we say takes the air out of a room, would you say that in front of the Blessed Sacrament? Well, that's an effective way to deoxygenize the room, so on.
Yeah. Beautiful. Unfortunately, I gave up wine for Lent, but I'll find another way to get some banter in.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm living, one of the priests I live with, he's giving up drinks for Lent. He said, with the caveat, unless the social situation calls for it. So